Over the course of about 40 years, the entire playbook for how to make a poor country rich did a complete 180. I mean, the core beliefs were just turned completely on their head. We went from a world that basically put all its faith in the government to one that put all its faith in the market. So how on earth did this massive reversal happen? Let's get into it. At the heart of this whole story are two ideas that are just polar opposites. On one side, you've got structuralism. The thinking here is that you just can't trust the free market to build a modern economy, so the government has to step in, protect its industries, and really guide the whole process. And on the other side, neoliberalism. It argues the exact opposite. It says the state is clumsy and inefficient, and the best thing it can do is just get out of the way and let the market work its magic. This clash of ideas would literally shape the destiny of entire continent.
You know, for about 35 years after World War II, structuralism was absolutely king. Its main strategy was this thing called import substitution industrialization, or ISI for short. The idea was pretty simple, actually. Instead of importing stuff like cars or TVs, developing countries should block those imports with trade barriers and build up their own infant industries to make those goods for their own people. This was the go-to playbook all across Latin America, Africa, and parts of Asia. But it had a huge, fatal flaw.
So the core problem was that the whole ISI model created an economy that just couldn't pay its own bills. On one hand, governments were running massive budget deficits, just pouring money into state-owned companies that weren't making a profit. And on the other hand, they had these huge current account deficits. See, to industrialize, they had to import all this expensive machinery. But the new industries they created were often so inefficient that they couldn't export anything to earn the money to pay for those imports. It was like the system was a leaky bucket, with money pouring out from both the top and the bottom.
This setup also created a really specific kind of corruption, something economists call rent-seeking. Think about it like this. If the government is the one handing out licenses to import goods, well, that piece of paper becomes incredibly valuable. You could buy a product at the world price and sell it for a much, much higher price at home. This created this massive incentive for businesses to cozy up to politicians and bribe officials. And it wasn't just some small side effect, this was incredibly costly, draining the national income and making it politically impossible to change things because, well, all the powerful people were getting rich from it.
So you've got these economies that are bleeding money and a political system that's impossible to reform. What do? Well, a lot of governments just took out the international credit card. They started borrowing enormous sums of money from foreign banks just to paper over the cracks and keep this ISI dream alive. But of course, this was never a real solution. It was just kicking the can down the road, and it was setting the stage for a gigantic crisis.
Okay, but while most of the developing world was driving straight towards a cliff, something truly amazing was happening over in a small corner of East Asia. A handful of economies, we're talking South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore, were on a completely different path, and the results they were getting were about to absolutely stun the world. I mean, just look at these numbers. They're staggering. Between 1965 and 1990, per capita income in East Asia grew at over 5% a year. In Latin America, it was less than 2%. And in sub-Saharan Africa, it was basically zero. That means East Asia's income was growing 26 times faster. They weren't just doing a little bit better, they were in a completely different universe. This huge gap in performance raised the billion-dollar question that would basically change modern economics. How in the world were they doing it? What was their secret sauce? Well, two major explanations popped up, and of course, they were total opposites. The neoliberal view, which was really championed by the World Bank, said it was all about the market. They argued these countries were succeeding because they got the prices right, kept inflation low, opened up to trade, and just let the market do its thing. But a completely different view argued that, no, the state was actually the hero of the story, using really smart industrial policies to actively guide their economies.
And you can see the evidence for that state-led argument right here. If you look at Taiwan and South Korea, their development wasn't random at all. Their governments deliberately guided them through specific stages, starting with simple stuff like textiles, then moving into heavy industries like steel, and eventually into high-tech electronics. This wasn't a market free-for-all, it was a carefully directed strategy.
So who was right, the market guys or the state guys? Well, the truth, as it usually is, seems to be somewhere in the middle. This quote from the economist Stephen Haggard, I think, sums it up perfectly. The East Asian governments created a stable, market-friendly environment. That's the permissive framework. But they didn't just stop there. They also used targeted policies to actively push their companies to go out and conquer global markets. It was this powerful one-two punch of state guidance and market discipline.
Now, while all the economists were debating the East Asian model, the bill for that old ISI strategy finally came due. All that heavy borrowing from the 70s collided with a bunch of international economic shocks, and it triggered a massive debt crisis in the early 1980s. The old model wasn't just sputtering, it was completely collapsing.
The meltdown basically happened in 3 steps. First, countries borrowed tons of cheap money all through the 70s. Then, the oil crisis hit, which made everything more expensive. But the final nail in the coffin came when global interest rates suddenly shot through the roof, turning their debts into an impossible burden. And then, bam, 1982, the whole system just implodes.
So with their economies in a total free fall, and with nobody else on Earth willing to lend them a dime, dozens of countries had to go, cap in hand, to the 2 organizations they saw as the lenders of last resort, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And believe me, those institutions had their own very strong ideas about what needed to change.
The price for a bailout was a complete economic makeover. The IMF and the World Bank pushed this package of reforms called structural adjustment, which later got nicknamed the Washington Consensus. The recipe had 3 main ingredients. First, stabilize the economy, which meant slashing government spending. Second, privatize all those inefficient state-owned companies. And third, liberalize the whole economy by tearing down trade barriers. It was a complete and total rejection of the old state-led model.
And let me be clear, this wasn't just a minor policy change. This was a global revolution. From Argentina to Zambia, Bolivia to Benin, country after country adopted these new market-first reforms. The age of state-led development was officially over. The age of neoliberalism had dawned.
But the story doesn't end there. By the 1990s, it was becoming pretty clear that just changing your policies, just getting the prices right, wasn't a silver bullet. Some countries adopted the reforms and took off, but others just stayed stuck. This led economists to a new idea. Maybe it wasn't just about the policies, but about the deeper underlying rules of the game, a country's institutions.
The new thinking really focused on this key difference. On one hand, you have what are called inclusive institutions, things like secure property rights, a predictable rule of law, the kinds of rules that give everybody a fair shot and an incentive to invest and create. On the other hand, you have extractive institutions, where the whole system is basically designed to let a small elite rig the game and enrich themselves at everyone else's expense.
And there's no better example of this in the entire world than the Korean Peninsula. I mean, it's a perfect natural experiment. You've got 2 countries, same people, same history, same culture. But South Korea built inclusive institutions, and it became one of the wealthiest countries on the planet. North Korea built deeply extractive institutions, and it led to economic collapse and horrific famine. It's just the starkest possible illustration of why these rules of the game are so incredibly important.
And that brings us right up to today. Because this debate, it is far from over. With the unbelievable economic success of China, which kind of blended market dynamism with very powerful state direction, a whole new model has entered the ring. This so-called Beijing Consensus is a modern-day challenge to that neoliberal idea, and it argues for a return to a much more state-led strategy. So we end right back where we started, with a huge clash of ideas. That decades-long battle between the state and the market is flaring up again, but this time the heavyweights are Washington and Beijing. And that leaves us with a pretty big question. Are we right now witnessing the beginning of the next great economic reversal? And what will that mean for the rest of us?